1:05, and we're trying to get into it. Welcome, everyone. Grab a seat where you feel like you want to. So I'm Paige I'm sorry. Let me get better at this. I'm Paige Ingram. I'll be moderating the panel today. Apologies for anyone who was super excited to see Lone Tran, but they give you all of the greetings. And what I do is I work as the cross-movement lead organizer with the Movement for Black Lives. Woo! Yes, shout out to Emperor DL squad. Right, okay. Yes, I love this. Keep doing this, please. And I also have the pleasure and the privilege of being on the leadership body of the Rising Majority. So we're here to have a good conversation, to be honest, and to work better, to get ourselves more free. So this is the panel of what Gaza teaches us, building a movement to end militarization and war. So maybe I'm saying something that a lot of you have heard, but I think it's important to say that, y'all, we are inside of a paradigm shifting moment, right? A lot has happened in the last 20 plus years, including the struggle for a free Palestine taking center stage in a way that the anti-war movement of the early 2000s did not take seriously. We have been witnessing a genocide of massive proportions, fueled and abetted by the US government via military aid, which is explicitly bombs tearing apart families, schools, bakeries, hospitals, you name the institution. Our movements have organized around ceasefire demand as an early entry-level demand, and this demand alone has and is reshaping movements in the United States for justice and dignity for all people. A new front of struggle has been opening up as millions have poured into the streets, thousands taking direct action, literally tens of millions of emails, phone calls into Congress, and more than 700,000 uncommitted votes. Right, shout out to that. Shout out to that. Okay? So our movements are connecting the dots and making it clear that everything matters right now. So in our session today, we hope that we can dig into a little bit more of the historical context, because this didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? That led to this moment, the opportunities and the challenges of this current moment, and how must we organize ourselves moving forward in order to make more possible, to build more power. So on today's panel, our comrades who have been organizing inside of this question of what does it mean to build a strong movement to end militarism and war. They will share reflections and lessons on more than 20 years of organizing and making an invitation to all of us to consider what we are best positioned to do right now, and how do we do it in such a manner that keeps the doors open for more opportunities and even bigger fights in the days and the years to come, because this is truly a protracted struggle. These fights will require us to weave together our struggles in more rigorous and creative ways. And so the Rising Majority is grateful to call these leaders and organizations our comrades as we bring together social movement organizations across issues, geographies, sectors, to build a powerful left for radical democracy and a regenerative economy that contributes towards breaking the chains of capitalist wars here and around the world. So let's give it up. Great, so now I get to sit down. You know, if the podium is there, we got to use it.
So now I have to sit down and we're going to dig into a conversation. And so what I ask is for our panelists, Montega Simmons from M4BL, Samer Arabi from AROC, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and Brittany Ramos de Barros from About Face Veterans Against the War. We're going to just open with this question. So actually it's more of a request. It's a request. Can each of you start by just situating us in this current moment and provide a bit of an assessment of where the anti-war, this anti-militarism movement is right now, and how do we get here? And I'll start to my, who wants to start? Okay, Samer.
I was voluntold.
Okay, great.
Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Samer. I work at the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. It's a San Francisco-based organization that fights for racial and economic justice. People heard of AROC, great.
Absolutely, props for AROC.
Thank you. And you know, we fight for the dignity and liberation of Arab communities both here and in our homelands. AROC has, of course, been working on a large anti-militarism campaign for many, many years. Situating things is going to be, it's a big ask, so somebody tap me if I start to yammer, but I think the important thing is to start by situating with where we are in terms of, if we want to think about the anti-war movement, where's the war movement? And you know, we're in a moment where the Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people has accelerated to a really unprecedented degree. I think it's important that we frame that as an acceleration, not something that started this year, but an ongoing 100-year campaign of the cleansing and dispossession of the Palestinian people. But in these past 9 months, you know, officially 40,000 dead. The Lancet now saying that number is more realistically 200,000. The displacement of millions, the destruction of all infrastructure in Gaza, and the collapse of every international liberal institution designed to prevent and hold accountable people that are that are committing these kinds of crimes. So we're living in a moment, I think, where we're seeing a really unprecedented collapse of the global system's ability to sort of contain and constrain actions like this, all at the sort of behest of the US that's willing to sort of let this war machine continue uninterrupted. It's a horrifying sight for all of us, and I think in the face of that, what we've seen is a really unprecedented mobilization of people in response, you know, not only in the US but globally, building a huge movement that's directly calling out not only what's happening to the Palestinian people, but in a way that I think is an extension of what I've seen in previous anti-war and anti-militarization mobilizations, a really explicit connection of all the different pieces that tie together how the suffering of the Palestinian people is tied directly to the suffering of us here, how the imperial project in Palestine is tied to imperial projects elsewhere, and how these sort of like intersectional struggles all actually go back to the same underlying root issues that need to be rooted out collectively. That movement, I think, has successfully eliminated the idea of Israel as a third rail in politics, right? The concept of progressive, except for Palestine, is dead. It's completely dead. I think we can say that definitively at this point. That's a huge win. It's a win that we really need to acknowledge. The level at which people have built Palestine into a core understanding of the left movement, and the way that that has been mobilized into local elections, to large-scale community mobilizations, to protests, to ceasefire resolutions, and to divestment, right? I think we're seeing BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a movement really expand in a way that would have felt unthinkable a few years prior. All of that, I think, are successes that we should reflect on and we should be really proud of. Places where I think we have not gotten to where we've wanted to get is that I'm sure those of you, well, first of all, the genocide is ongoing. The ceasefire feels way out of reach. Biden's still around, sending weapons to Israel on a weekly basis. If folks saw, there's a new batch of 500-pound bombs that recently got released to the Israeli government. Those are failures in our movement to meaningfully shift power. And I think in the context of that, we're also dealing with burnout. Those of you who are working on Palestine stuff, I'm sure, feel this very deeply. Despair, a sense that, you know, a flagging sense of energy and commitment and the ability to show up on the streets every week is getting progressively harder. And what we're seeing, in my eyes, is the difficulty of moving from a mobilization of people on Palestine into organizing people on Palestine, to shift from getting people to talk about the issue of the genocide to addressing the systemic issues that underline that issue. And now I'm officially moving into Yammer mode, so I'm going to stop and let my co-panelists talk.
I'm Brittany Ramos-Taberos. I'm an organizer with About Face Veterans Against the War. And I'm going to take a second to admit that I'm crying and not apologize for that, because I refuse to stop feeling what's happening. And I don't think it's true that in order to be effective, we have to completely compartmentalize ourselves. I think it's actually the dehumanization that has made our challenge so difficult, right? That tendency in our society. And as a military veteran, I think that my inability to dehumanize the people in Afghanistan, who I had been so aggressively conditioned to believe, to see as dehumanized beings, my inability to buy into that in some ways brought me to this place, because I'm a person who was raised in a Republican, evangelical military family in the South. And when I deployed, I went to school on an Army scholarship. And by the time I deployed, I was liberal, but I was still a true believer in this core idea that we were fighting for good things, right? That maybe we were making some mistakes along the way, but that ultimately we had these good intentions. And it wasn't, unfortunately, until I was confronted with the violence that I was participating in, that I could reckon with how untrue that was. And I came back and I got a job at a philanthropic organization as my first job back. I moved to the reserves. I wanted to get out of the military, but I didn't know how because of my scholarship. And I joined this philanthropic organization and I was like, now I'm really in this institution that's really gonna do good work, right? I thought I was signing up to do this service, but now really I am here. And then I learned about the ways that philanthropy falls short as well, frankly. And that led me to grassroots organizing. It's a long story, but I think that framing is important because I think so many of us work at institutions that are, that we are left of the politics of the institution as a whole. And I think part of our conversation today is not just what have been the successes and failures of anti-war organizing that have led us to this moment that tell us something about what could make more things possible going forward. But it's also reckoning with our own positioning as individuals in institutions that are letting us down, right? Sometimes in really profound ways. And what do? Whether it's the institution that we're working in or it's the institution of our government, right? That we can't escape in some ways. And yet are utterly faced with only enemies, right? Whether they're neoliberal enemies who ultimately just want to maintain the status quo that allows them to sound like they are progressive and these things, but ultimately are fine with continuing to carry out a genocide as long as it doesn't interrupt their profit motives or their ability to exploit, or I should say more directly, their donors' ability to exploit, right? And or whether it's truly fascist elements that don't actually want to maintain the power structure as it exists. They want totalitarianism, right? They want a revolutionary form of totalitarianism that would make it impossible for us to even have a conversation like this in a room like this. And so, that's the moment that we're reckoning with, and yet all of us are positioned in this moment where we've failed for 9 months to stop a genocide. And so I think that my comments today, I'm just going to preface, are probably going to be a lot of kind of depressing insights, because that is fundamentally a depressing thing to have to confront. Yeah. That we don't have the power to stop even a genocide, something that is so nakedly horrific, something where the people who are carrying it out are openly saying their intentions, and yet we're still arguing on the doors, right, about what the actual intentions are, when it's in black and white all over the place. And so for me, I think that there have been many, in a way, we're looking at a moment where we're both seeing the incredible strength and successes of Palestinian organizing that has happened for decades, that enabled this paradigm shifting moment to even be possible. And they did that in conditions where they were relegated and treated like they weren't part of the progressive movement, like it was some kind of fringe issue, that, right? And in many of our spaces even, right? And yet, if it hadn't been for the diligence and determination and frankly survival requirements, right, of people who were organizing for their lives in this case, then what's happening right now would not have been possible.
That's right.
And at the same time, we're also seeing a moment that is characterized by the failures of US-based anti-war organizing. We've, for decades, had a movement that failed, I think, to connect the dots between organized in a siloed way that attacked one issue at a time, one war at a time, and yet often felt the need to laundry list every possible thing, every horror that the US was carrying out everywhere, to the extent that we lost any kind of audience. We struggled to connect with an audience where they were. We also failed to connect each of those conflicts to the core of the machine and why those conflicts were really happening. A perfect example is Afghanistan. We were successfully, as an anti-war movement in the United States, we made that war unpopular. But I don't know that we actually successfully made that war unpopular because of capital and corporations driving war, right? Mm-hmm. There were nativist elements that were in some cases effective at getting people to be like, we don't want money for, it's not money for war, it's money, right? Like, that didn't fully connect with the full machine of what was at play, and therefore left people vulnerable to future misinformation campaigns to generate consent for future wars. Because then people were left evaluating conflict by conflict, whether that one was justifiable or not, on a case-by-case basis. Conversely, when we have effectively been able to build audience recognition of the machine at the core, it carries forward issue to issue. Someone who understands that the so-called global war on terror was not actually about trying to save us all from the terrorists, and in fact was about an industry that wanted to take advantage, like frame this as a geopolitical opportunity for politicians who needed an ideological reason, and for an industry to make a bunch of money off of. Folks who are inoculated and understand that war that way also understand Palestine differently, also understand what's happening in Haiti differently, also understand, right, it allows us, and so I think that that's one of the core things we have to reckon with in this moment, is how we make sure, and I think that that's one of the things that makes this moment paradigm shifting, is that we are doing it. But I think that that's a charge for us, is in all of our issues. There should be no climate justice organization that does not understand why the fight for a free Palestine does not directly connect to climate. Not because of the impact on climate in Palestine, which is a component, but specifically because the same engine that continues to manifest violence after violence after violence around the world and in our communities with policing here, policing and beyond here, is the same engine that doesn't want to address climate change, is the same engine that is doing everything it can to undermine labor rights, is the same engine, right? And so we have to understand that if we are stop attacking the issue and start attacking the machine, and when we understand the issue that way, it becomes impossible for us to not be working with deep solidarity more strategically.
Thank you. I'm going to open with a couple of requests. Like one, I stop and take a breath, because this is a lot. And over the last 9 months, many of you have literally been navigating a lot of emotions that you didn't understand, dealing with conditions that you didn't know the roots of. And a lot of that's going to come to fore in this conversation. For me, it's really alive in a deep way right now. Like Cori Bush, when she introduces herself, she's like, like St. Louis and I rise. Sometimes St. Louis rise out of me when we start tapping into these conditions. So one, I'm going to request that you please lean into generative tension. Tension's not a bad thing. Ignoring tension hurts us. Invisibilizing it hurts us. So expect what comes out of here. I may get a little energetic. I'm not lashing out, I promise you. I promise you. The other side of the request is to our moderator. I want to respect the fact that we got limited time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also this is all spawning a lot for me. I'll try not to repeat a lot, but I think it speaks to some of the framing I've been thinking about around the question. So,
Got you.
yeah. So, yeah, Montega Simmons, he, him pronouns, Movement for Black Lives, born and raised in St. Louis. So for me, it's impossible to assess where the anti-war movement is strategically without an examination of the broader field of movement and the various sectors of struggle that we actually are continuing to confront. I believe years from now, generations who actually inherit all the work that we're going to do in this period are going to look back and see it all as a phase of a third Reconstruction. That's not my term. It's something we've been saying inside of left movement for a long time. And especially in regard to the Black liberation movement or the way we've reframed it today as a movement for Black lives. So the grounding for my assessment largely lives and breathes in St. Louis, Missouri, where I'm from. 10 years before the uprisings that were triggered by the murder of Michael Brown Jr. was my own entry point into movement. It was a period still reeling from 9/11, domestic onslaught of domestic militarism in the form of ICE and the newly formed Department of Homeland Security. And as Islamophobia and fear found new sanction and investment at the federal level, locally we saw in city after city investments in police departments to also become more militarized, getting equipment that in many cases were actually meant to be deployed in the theater of war. And they were now at the fingertips of racist and fearful cops, many of whom were now also receiving training on how to respond to growing protests and resistance conditions and dissent from the IDF, being facilitated by the Anti-Defamation League. Communities around the country experience increased policing, criminalization, and rates of incarceration as an occupation. And while many of the anti-war protesters were directly focused on the military aggression abroad, it took much deeper roots in the cities and communities around the country where we live. The anti-war movement, like other sectors, wasn't always good, to your point about building these connections between all the different fronts. So in addition, the issues of the poor, Black, migrant, women, femme, queer, trans, gender nonconforming folks were never a priority. They were always a talking point that would conveniently be shifted to the bottom of the priority list when we got to the negotiation table. These communities who are most directly related to the experience of populations around the world in which we're actually projecting our military power were often invisibilized, especially during the latter part of that decade when the economy went into crisis and sent our communities into varying levels of austerity. And during that period, you saw shifts. People lived with shifts. They lived with less in their paychecks, different forms of limited healthcare, divestments from their communities, and the only money they saw going in was into policing, again. I say all this to say the uprisings that we witnessed and participated in 2014 didn't come out of a vacuum. There were conditions that our folks had lived with for a very long time. And to be frank, during this period, when you organized around Black liberation or just justice, you had to connect it to something else. If it wasn't connected to housing, connected to labor, connected to another issue, it was hard to even talk about. So when the people of Ferguson took the streets and literally called it what it was, a military occupation, in front of MRAPs, that was a rupture in a real way. And part of what happened in that space, Palestinians saw it and reached out. And folks here reached back. People leaned in across the spectrum, including progressive Jewish folks who showed up for fights around minimum wage, fights around housing, but continued to raise money for the Zionist project, which created its own tension inside that movement. For us that were living directly in that crucible, it felt like We had to figure out our way beyond what was reform, and I'm speaking specifically of Black movement and my time with OBS and what's become the movement for Black Lives. The assessment called for an articulation of what became the Vision for Black Lives, and in it articulated explicitly a demand for divestment from militarism at home and abroad. It named explicitly, and we caught hell for it, that the investment into Israel was complicity with genocide. During that period, you saw not only Black folks stand up, genderqueer, trans, progressive white folks came together in a spectrum of unity in ways that, to be frank, neither side of the aisle. When I say that, I say one that's more explicitly committed to capital, one to people. We ain't got to get into that deep nuance. But neither one of them knew what to do with it. Because often this side of the aisle that's supposed to be devoted to people are the places where these police departments were running havoc. They've been in chaos like this ever since. They've been in tension because all of a sudden, those of us whose priorities were at the bottom of the list were inserting in ways that they couldn't ignore. Asserting not only in the streets, but asserting around policy. Asserting in ways that the systems had to respond to. I'm framing this to say, like, not only are we in a longer arc, but I want you to be able to connect all of these things. So when we say that Cop City is capital's response to a demand for divestment, and they moved around beyond public money to private money to try and put it out of our reach, we have to make that connection. It's directly connected to climate. They literally are killing a forest that's the heart of a city and devastating it in the name of instituting additional militarization. We're in a period where, again, all of us are being called to make harder choices than we have before and reckon with the things that we actually were initially programmed with about who we were, what was right, what was wrong. Reckon with hard language like settler colonialism, like what do these things mean? We've dealt with displacement, you're dealing with evictions, you're dealing with a housing crisis, and capital is continuing to assert. These contradictions are happening in front of our face. And they're all directly connected to this question of militarism being fueled by capital. So I'll stop there.
Thank you all. I'm going to skip the second question. So, thank you for bringing up the cop cities. It's not just Atlanta. There are about 70 cop cities that are in different phases, from proposals to construction. And so that's something that, as an organizer with M4BL, I'm constantly thinking about. So we know that our fights against state violence in the US are very much connected to the struggles, plural, happening across the globe, including countries whose violence in the U.S. directly enables, such as Israel. How do we make these connections more visible to our people? I hear that as work that has begun but does not feel complete. Samar, do you want to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think those connections are being made more explicit. I think we're seeing that happen in a really real way. You know, not only do we hear folks here talking about how, like, the Black struggle and the Palestinian struggle have all of these parallels, but, you know, even in Palestine, you know, years ago, you were hearing people say, what's happening to us feels like what happened to George Floyd. Like, you hear that in Palestine. You know, these connections are becoming very explicit. And it's not surprising because, again, they come from the same root. You know, there's this concept, I think it's Foucault, it's like the imperial boomerang, the idea that, you know, colonial projects will inevitably turn their systems of surveillance and control and repression that they use in the colonies back on to their, like, native populations, right? And we're seeing that so explicitly here, not only, you know, in terms of surveillance and policing, but also just the sort of the underlying systems that allow for the large-scale repression of people, these sort of like machines of exploitation, right? Like exploited Palestinian labor and exploited prison labor look very similar, you know, if you squint your eyes a little bit. And I think there's real power in this idea of Palestine as a mirror. You know, what I hear constantly from people who go to Palestine from the US is that it's a way of understanding what's happening here refracted through a situation where you're not so steeped in the propaganda or the kind of like things that you've been told about the society that you grew up in. You know, the way that I've heard it most powerfully is that a friend of mine came back from Palestine and was talking about how the literal walls that they encountered all over Palestine helped them see the metaphorical walls here, right? The walls that separate our racial communities, the walls that separate our classes. Not to mention the physical walls that also exist here, by the way. And I think it's good to situate that within an understanding for how those systems of oppression operate, right? And again, I think Palestine is a really powerful mirror here. I think looking at the US colonial project and how Israel advances that colonial project is something that we can see, you know, historically, right? Israel was a main backer of apartheid South Africa. They were a key part of the coup against the Allende regime in Chile and the backing of like the fascists in the Congo. And that's happening now, right? The genocide in the Congo is not unrelated to the US's support of Israel. Those are Israeli weapons and mercenaries that are operating in the Congo right now. And so that underlying interconnectedness, I think, is the thing that we really need to be able to sort of build a systemic or structural understanding of the problems that we can address and point at directly and say, these are the things that need to go. You know, and something that I hear from Palestinians all the time is people, you know, anyone who works in the Palestine space like gets a lot of well-intentioned folks come up to them and be like, how can we help you? And Palestinians are always like, we don't want your help. Like, we're not asking for your help. We don't want like the charity of, oh, those poor Palestinians. We want you to fight your fight, right? We want you to struggle in your struggle and understand how that struggle is connected to ours. Because by fixing those systems here is what allows Palestine to be free. It's not saying like, oh, you know, like Biden needs to issue a strongly worded letter to Netanyahu. Like, no, we need to. It's the complicity of the military-industrial complex in the United States that is sustaining this war. You know, you hear time and time again, there's an ammunition shortage, right? Like, the Israelis have used so many munitions in Gaza. You know, we can talk about the scale, but to the point that they've had to pull out their old munition stores from the 60s and the 50s, that Israeli generals are saying that if the US turns off the tap, we can't sustain the war for a week, not 1 week. And yet, here we are, right? And so people need to be fighting that fight here. And that fight here is the fight for Palestinian liberation because it's like a sort of collective liberation structure. But yeah, lots to say, but I'm gonna keep going, so I'll pass it on.
And so, like, how do we do that, right? Like, how do we move folks? One, I think, is that getting to what I was speaking about before is that we have to, part of developing a strong anti-war movement is understanding that a strong anti-war movement is fundamentally a strong people's movement. For really what we're talking about is political revolution. We're talking about changing who gets to make decisions about our bodies and our resources. Right? And we're talking about what are the structural changes that would be necessary in order to make that possible. But when we jump right there, we lose people, right? And so I think coming back to the here and now a little bit more is I'm really interested in the people who I talk to who are not with us, but they're compassionate. It's like you're talking to them and you're like, I can see you wanting to be with me. And what is the thing that hangs them up? It's the belief, which is the same thing for every single military violence that the United States is carrying out around the world, indirectly or directly, is either they're made to believe that it's necessary in order for them to be safe, or it's necessary in order to help a victim somewhere else be safer, right? That is always the rationale. And I think that we have an opportunity here to continue digging in and unraveling that logic. And that logic is emotional. right? The reason that people are willing to overlook violence in our own communities, of their neighbors being shot, all the way to Palestinians being slaughtered, is not because they're like, fuck those guys, right? It's I mean, on some level, right? But like, on a deeper level, the reason for that is because they're motivated by this feeling of need for safety, which is biological, right? That need to feel safe is fundamental. We can't blame people for that, but we have allowed our opponents to monopolize the narrative about what makes us safe, right? And so that the piece about investing in divestment, we've made incredible gains in the ability to even have a conversation about divesting from police, and yet the conflict that we're still bumping up against with people is this hang up on like, how will we be safe? And we need to have an answer for that, right? We need to focus our messaging and our fight for a future around addressing that very emotional need and objection to the proposition that we're inviting people to think about and to allow their imagination to explore, right? And I think in order to do that, we have to be better at talking not just about these isms, these systems, racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, right, sexism, all of these isms. We have to talk about why those isms exist. And if we talk about why those isms exist, we cannot not understand how all of our fights fundamentally require a strong anti-war movement. Because I use a framework of a house of oppression. Why was the house, what is the purpose of a house? Is shelter, right? And so the roof of the house, the purpose of the house is and always has been economic exploitation. From the very first colonists that landed on Turtle Island, their purpose was to exploit resources and human beings for the sake of economic exploitation and gain. That was always the purpose. That is the founding purpose of this nation, right, that exists. That has always been the roof of the house of oppression that we're living in. But what are the pillars that are upholding that roof? White supremacy, a system of social hierarchy that stratifies the working class, our society, on the basis of your proximity to a political definition of whiteness is one pillar, right? That stratifies the masses and keeps us from being united in our efforts to crumble, to see that even the purpose is economic exploitation half the time, right? The twin pillar that often gets left out, I think, of this conversation is patriarchy. You can call it heteropatriarchy, you can call it whatever version of patriarchy, but fundamentally a system of social hierarchy that stratifies society on the basis of your proximity to a political definition of manhood. Both of those definitions being political is really key too, right? Neither of them are fundamentally biological or real, both of them are political. And these twin pillars are self-reinforcing. And so when the project of white supremacy as a social stratification mechanism is failing, the patriarchy steps in. We are watching an exodus of Black, Latino, and other men of color support Trump. It has been horrifying as a community organizer, as someone taught on doors. The amount of men of color who I'm talking to who are like, I didn't support Trump before, but I'm supporting him this year, I think. And I'm like, why? And the only reason, they're not using this language, but the only reason is machismo, is this concept of like, I like his vibe, his personality. And I'm hearing what they're saying, which is actually about this patriarchy, right? This performance of political manhood, which is covering down and addressing the fact that there is racial solidarity that is being developed right now at a rate that is really impressive and important and paradigm shifting, right? And so those pillars, but the foundation of the house, the thing that keeps the house standing at all costs is militarism. A system of beliefs that promotes and the necessity and importance of militarized state violence and justifies it, right? It's a system of beliefs and values, just like the other ones. But militarism covers down every single time. And all of the things that we're working on, every single issue, social justice, if you're fighting for even the liberated future that I'm fighting for, we cannot get it if we ignore militarism. And militarism is so entrenched in the DNA of what is America. And fundamentally, that is connected to the mythology of the idea of what makes us safe. Because in order to believe in the version of our opponents, of what makes us safe, you have to also buy into this mythology of who we are. Because you have to ignore the colonial violence that founded this country. You have to ignore the chattel slavery that built this country, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because in order to confront that root, you have to confront that the purpose of all of that was economic exploitation, right? That explains all of those united atrocities and also struggles in the present. And so I think that those two things really connected to each other are things that we have to hold as strategists and as organizers as we think about what it means to not just continue to protest power, but to build power. That's the last thing, and I know I said a lot, so I want to go to Montega, but this last piece is just like, we have to build power. We have to stop basing our movements, our mobilizations, et cetera, on this idea to express ourselves. And we have to get disciplined and rigorous and serious about the fact that we can win popular opinion right now and still not have the power to do shit about it. That's what we have to focus on changing.
No, don't be sorry.
I got going.
At all.
I get preaching.
Yeah. It's a little frustrating they confine these discussions to an hour, because I know it'd be so much better if we could really be an official dialogue. So I want to build off what you've laid out for folks in that, well, one, I make no assumptions about how you view yourself in this work. I come to this space with the aim to become and be and transformed into revolutionary and contribute to that type of change. Not all of you here even necessarily view yourself as part of a social movement. You may be an advocate or change agent of some kind. But because you've actually accepted that responsibility, you are an organizer or facilitator of that change, which means the state of fear that you just articulated, it's our responsibility, one, to, and I know we use this in revolutionary circles, but I think it's one that everybody has to do. We have to be very rigorous in this moment. The folks who we're actually actively working to support their transformations into an agent of their own change are inundated with fear, with technology, with messaging that is confusing and leans toward not only magical thinking, but nonsensical thinking. Our role has to be, one, even when we are emotionally pulled, we have to find ways to stay grounded. We have to actually stay in principled conversation, struggle, and grounded not necessarily in the things we believe, but in the material facts that are before us. I say that because people are watching the theater of the last 10 years and somehow making this shit make sense. I'm going to take off, like I'm not wearing any like C3, C4, because I just want to be very blunt about what we just witnessed on a number of fronts. Going back to my city, the shit that pisses me off is we've literally seen someone who was elected as a progressive prosecutor be bought off as a mercenary to now run against movement in a democratic process. And people are buying the lies that they're spending their money to tell. We've seen the circumvention of democratic process in city after city, and I'm explicitly thinking about Atlanta, around Cop City. Movements built muscle to gain signatures, to motivate people, to get them to turn out, to participate in the process, and then they short circuit the process. We've seen circumvention of national presidential process, only for now them to question their candidate when there was no effective primary process intentionally. And this is the reality on both sides of the aisle. And folks that we talk to every day see this as normal. The only way it gets interrupted is in the work that we do. We've got to cut through the fog, cut through the AI, cut through all the memes on TikTok, IG, to make sure that they're actually getting something that's more grounded. So they understand why they got less money to spend. They understand why it's not going as far. They understand why, after watching the news, they feel more afraid than they did before they turned it on. That's our role. No matter where you see yourself in the spectrum, But I think there is still an ongoing invitation for us to hold some of that together, because I think all we've got is each other in this moment.
Do you want me to last question or Q&A?
To you, I think we can open it.
Got 10 minutes.
Great. You know, I believe in a democratic process, so I won't just decide as a moderator. I have to check in with my comrades. We want to open it up to questions. So I'm going so hard. Because we are, you know, streaming and for access, I'm going to run the mic. We're going to take 2 questions. Discipline, 2 questions, questions. And then our panel will answer, and we will have to close to move on to the next thing. So I'll just get a hand. I see you, friend. Anyone else have a question that they want to ask these brilliant people? Okay. Hold on. Raise your hand again. It's hard to see. All right. We'll take 2, and then if we have time for another one, we'll see.
Hey y'all, thank you so much for so much of what you said. Wish we could dig into everything, but I want to hone in specifically on something that I think all the panelists have touched on, which is the difficulty of translating the energy of this movement into legislative and electoral victories. You know, for people like us, I assume there's many of us who work somewhere within the Democratic Party structure. I've been working to elect Democrats here up and down the ticket in Maryland, and I feel like many of you, alienation and divorce from this party that I've believed in so much, specifically on this issue. And I watched closely with Jamal Bowman in New York, hoping that, you know, we would have a little bit of a data point, something that I can turn to my electeds and say, see, we can run this, we can win. But so far across the country, the evidence that, that can break through some of that cynicism isn't there. So how do you see the future of this movement, and what do you think it's going to take for this energy to translate into legislative and electoral victory?
Thank you, comrade.
Yeah, thank you all. My name is Zave. I use they, he pronouns. Yeah, I wanted to ask, in the anti-war movement specifically, one of you said that the paradigm has completely shifted on Palestine, and I completely agree with the kinds of people I'm seeing out in the streets when I'm mobilizing. Like nurses are showing up, teachers are showing up, and students are showing up in huge numbers. But what I've been hearing from other leaders in the movement is that it's specifically we need the labor unions to show up. So I'm wondering if you guys agree with that, and if you have any thoughts on ways that we can get the labor and workers to show up in that capacity.
Okay. I'm going to try to go super fast so that we have time for more questions, but I'll probably fail. To do the second first, if that's all right, I think we shouldn't underestimate how much labor has been showing up. You know, at this point, labor organizations representing over half of organized labor have explicitly called for a ceasefire, and most of them have now called for ending weapon shipments to Israel. That's a really big deal. In a way, I would almost flip that question around, right? What are we doing to show up for labor to make sure that we have their back as they're being attacked for supporting Palestine? You know, and as a really clear example of this, it's going to be a little wonky, so bear with me. You know, folks saw all the stuff that happened at UCLA, right, where the protesters were absolutely battered by the police and by counter-protesters, which led to a UC union strike, where the union, the labor union, in solidarity with the students who were battered, went on strike. As a result of them going on strike, that union, among others, had been in negotiations with the California state legislature, the assembly, on a benefits while they're on strike bill. And a giant chunk of Democrats who had previously supported that exact bill last year voted it down this year. So benefits for striking workers in California is dead, specifically because they were like, well, why should we support these unions that are throwing down for Palestine? So we need to have labor's back when things like that happen, right? Again, this is the idea of those interconnected struggles. To go to the other thing, and I also touch on a thing that you said, Brittany said this a lot, and it's one of my favorite terms, which is paradigm shift. It's a thing we say all the time, but like means a specific thing. Like I used to like vanilla, and now I like chocolate. It's like not a paradigm shift. It's an idea that actually came out of science, right? Like the way that scientific discoveries happen, that we have this conception of things just sort of moving in an arc forward, and that's not really how it works. How it works is that things become stagnant. You develop a sort of existing set of assumptions and operating procedures that at some point no longer work. They fail to meet the moment. And to break out of that moment is a thing that requires people who are like, no, this is not working. These systems don't work anymore. Newtonian physics no longer work. But those people are ridiculed, right? And they're marginalized and they're minimized, and it's only later that historically revised we have like, oh yeah, of course, everyone realized that was wrong. We're clearly in that moment, right? And so talking about the Democratic Party and talking about what's happening right now, like the bottom has fallen out of the center. I mean, it couldn't get any clearer than it is right now, with Joe Biden in particular being like, yeah, I'm gonna lose, but I'm gonna stay, right? Like, we've lost all logical structure. And no one can defend it anymore because they're defending a system that no longer represents reality. So, this is obviously something that we have been seeing in Palestine, right? Joe Biden has no problem cannibalizing the entire, international legal system to protect Israel. Trump has no problem cannibalizing the domestic legal system to protect himself. Those things aren't that different. That doesn't mean that the parties aren't different. It just means that those structures are losing legitimacy. And so what do we replace it with, right? I think the big mistake that we sometimes make is thinking of the Democratic Party as a monolith. Like, the Democratic Party is Joe Biden. The Democratic Party is a terrain of struggle, right? Like, it does not have to exist as it exists right now, and it's incumbent on us to engage with it. That's why the Bowman loss, I think, is a particularly tragic loss. And there's more that we can do there. I said I would be quick, and I didn't.
Okay, I think really quickly, Summer said a lot of what I probably would have said, so I'll just add that that means that we need to wrestle with the reactionary tendency, that the response to what's happening in Palestine and our crushing disappointment about the reality that neoliberals who are invested in the current decision-making structure of our government, aka Joe Biden and the mainstream Democratic Party, are our enemies, right? They're not just they're our enemies, like MAGA are our enemies, and yet they want very different things than the MAGA movement wants, and it doesn't actually serve us to react and to be like, everything sucks, and become go into despair and just withdraw. That's not actually strategically good for the movement for Palestine or for any of our movements in the long run. It is because we don't have leverage in these terrains of struggle that we actually can't win some of these races right now. We don't have the infrastructure. I mean, I was cobbling together a Google sheet of all the phone banks that were happening, and organizations were like, oh wait, we are having things at the same time, because that was how ad hoc all of our stuff was for Bowman. The left was arguing about whether or not we should support AIPAC's enemy in that race until the day he lost, and still. And that AIPAC spent unprecedented money to get someone out who they saw as their enemy. Even if you don't see Bowman as our champion, our enemies losing is good for us. Even if it's our enemies losing and a different enemy being in who wants a different thing, who doesn't want revolutionary totalitarianism, who wants things that are ultimately also going to be state violence, and who also, I know it's gross to talk about, but this is where we have to have the discipline to not make this about our feelings. They're all our enemies. We're in a fucking fight. We can't beat both of them at once. We don't have that power. If we're going to build the power, in order to beat both of them, we have to navigate difficult contradictions now, and we have to have the courage to have those fights with each other, face to face, in principled ways. That's what this moment right now calls us to, because if we don't do that, we're never going to actually build the infrastructure we need to win, so that we have the people in office to make legislative wins.
That's right.
We need the votes.
I'm gonna try and do 30 seconds on the first question. One, I wanna make sure we don't invisibilize those folks and the victories that we have done in this assessment. Cori Bush emerged directly from movement. Summer Lee is directly connected to this kind of work. They've passed legislation that they are responding to and subverting the systems to respond to. So I think, one, the party system as it exists is its own crisis, but we're also seeing systems of democracy collapse, which urges us to create alternatives that our people can lean into, despite what this overall system will do.
Great. So
And Cori Bush's election is coming up. Not speaking as about face, speaking as a concerned person, knowing she's trailing in the polls, and we did not get our shit together the way that we needed to for Bowman, and we still can for Cori. So I just have to make that plug.
yes, these comments are for educational purposes only, as Rising Majority is a C3. So unfortunately, we can't have any more questions, but I do want to leave you with some clear takeaways in case you are wondering what to tell your people about this panel. So first of all, open invitation. The doors to movement are open, okay? And Rising Majority in particular, we have been building a shared vision to contend for power because we are also very soberly clear about our lack of power and what that has meant, not just when it comes to Gaza and the movement for free Palestine, but so many of our issues. And so, join us. You know who we are. You can use the app or whatever and find us. Addressing the military-industrial complex is crucial for all of the issues that we are fighting for, and I think that Brittany very eloquently pointed that out to us. Next, that regardless of perhaps even, depending on your situation, the isolation or the lack of power that you may feel in this moment, it's important for us as individuals, for us as organizations, whatever pods that we're in, that we need to make an assessment of power and our access to it because the reality is that we have access to power in ways that we don't even see sometimes because we feel so powerless in this moment. But there are things that you can do, there are people that you can tap that you have not thought about because you haven't opened up your imagination towards it. So you have to find your people and you have to really think through what can I do and what can I do differently. And lastly, we can't afford to cede any spaces when it comes to this fight. We have to be in 10 toes down. And that your organizations, any of y'all's organizations, you have a responsibility to assess where your money is going, what vendors are you using, what's good with this 401k plan, and you have to, and if you have no other step that you feel like you can make this step. Because at the end of the day, a huge connective tissue, whether we're talking about policing in the US, whether we're talking about Palestine, whether we're talking about climate, all of these things, is that there needs to be en masse a huge divest and invest work. So if you needed a starting point, perhaps that could be it. And I'll also say this, because we wouldn't be good organizers if we didn't have a call to action. So I don't know if you heard, but Netanyahu is trying to stay in the good graces of the administration, who has sent billions of dollars in weapons. And there are plans for him to come to DC and speak at Congress this month on July 24th, which is Rashida Tlaib's birthday, and I do not believe that is a coincidence. So, simply put, we cannot allow him to come into this country without being met by resistance. And there are mobilization efforts happening in DC. If you are looking for information, a good place to start is to follow PYM, Palestinian Youth Movement. Rising Majority will have a presence there, and we hope to see you there. There is also a Not Another Bomb mobilization efforts that is coming out of the work of Uncommitted. So if you are interested in digging into that, you can come and talk to me. I'll give you some links. And unfortunately, we are over time. We're at 2:05, so we have to close. But I want to thank you for staying present and staying committed into fighting in the ways that we can to build power and to not just to manifest, but to actualize a free Palestine. So thank you so much.
We'll stay down front, but yeah, we'll stay down front.